Okay. Great. All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be introducing yet another inspirational speaker to you all today in the continuation of our Indigenous Perspectives on the Environment seminar. Sally Jewell graduated from the University of Washington in 1978 with a degree in mechanical engineering. She went on to work as an oil engineer, a banker, and the CEO of the outdoor gear co-op REI from 2005 to 2013, where she became known for not only growing the brand, but for her involvement in environmental conservation and sustainability. These efforts were noticed by President Obama's administration, and she was nominated and confirmed as Obama's Secretary of the Interior in 2013 with substantial bipartisan support. Sally's many accomplishments at the Department of Interior include the establishment of Bears Ears National Monument in Utah in collaboration with 5 area tribes, the restoring of the indigenous name Denali to North America's highest peak, the establishment of the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan in California, and the establishment of the Every Kid in a Park program, a successful campaign designed to make America's national parks more accessible to kids and families from all walks of life. More recently, Sally has served as a founder and advisor to the UW College of the Environment's Earth Lab. She has served as the interim CEO of the Nature Conservancy, and she now holds the Fritzky Chair in Leadership with the UW Foster School of Business. I've come to know Sally well over the last few years through her generous participation as a guest instructor on a number of my field courses in national parks. An avid outdoorswoman, she has backpacked up and down mountains with us in Olympic National Park. She's even sea kayaked with us in Glacier Bay National Park up in Alaska. It's perhaps no surprise that she was well known in Washington, D.C. for requiring the fittest security detail of any government employee. Although I hear rumor that Deb Haaland may be giving you a run for your money in that department. So I can honestly say firsthand that Sally is as inspiring a person as you'd ever hope to meet, and I'm grateful to consider her a friend and mentor. More importantly, I'm grateful for the work she has done for our students, the university, and indeed our country. So please join me and welcome Sally Jewell. A virtual round of applause.
Thank you for the virtual round of applause.
Yeah.
That was a very kind introduction, Tim. And whether you can tell or not, I am not Indigenous, but I'm proudly wearing some Indigenous jewelry, in this case, wampum from the Wampanoag tribe of Aquinnah Indians from Massachusetts. And it's a shell. It was just a delight to work with so many tribal leaders and tribal communities. And I will begin by just acknowledging that I'm on the shared lands and waters of the Coast Salish people. And in my home in West Seattle, I'm not far from the water, and I look out over the Salish Sea, which has been, stewarded since time immemorial by the tribes of this region, and they remain a very active participant in their stewardship today, mostly through their work in the Northwest Intertribal Fish Commission, which really co-manages the fishery for Washington State. So it's a pleasure to be with you. And this is not quite like some of our other adventures together, Tim, but it's certainly a shorter commute and less physically fit. And yes, Deb Haaland just ran a marathon, so good for her.
Yeah.
I didn't do those.
I was amazed. It's very impressive. Well, both of you are extremely impressive. And yes, thank you, Sally, for acknowledging the Coast Salish peoples of this land. And that is important, and that has been a major theme of this seminar so far, is thinking about what these land acknowledgements mean. And certainly the commitment of government to the historical treaties and laws that are in place, continue to be in place today with respect to tribes and the rights of Indigenous people. So without further ado, I want to launch into this question in a little bit more depth here. And that is, I was wondering if you could tell us, about the work of the Department of the Interior and how Interior's work relates to tribes and the rights of Indigenous people, and then B, how you as a non-Indigenous person born in England, and in fact, coming from a background in business and engineering, were able to get up to speed on the relevant issues concerning tribes and Indigenous rights as you entered that position as Secretary of the Interior.
That's a mouthful.
It is.
Yeah, let me just relate a little bit about what is the Department of the Interior. You hear foreign governments talking about the Interior Ministry, and that's more like the Department of Homeland Security and FBI, and it's more law enforcement in country. The Department of the Interior was jokingly called the Department of Everything Else when it was created in 1849. And at that time, the relationship with tribes was in the War Department. And one of the things that I talked to Deb Haaland about when she took office, and one of the things that I did not get done while I was there, is that when you sit in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, there's the flags of all the military services in addition to the American flag. And if you look at pictures you see of press conferences and things, you'll see them there. And on the top of the Army flag are these ribbons of all of the military campaigns that they fought. And I'd go in that room and I'd see a ribbon that would say Cherokee or Choctaw. And they reflected the Indian Wars, where the US government was at war with tribes. And so when the Department of the Interior was created, the relationship shifted to Interior. And, it has a checkered history. Forced assimilation through boarding schools with kind of an unstated objective, or maybe even stated in some ways, we need to kill the Indian to save the man, right? So that's about cultural genocide. And in some cases, the consequences were real genocide. So it's had a tricky history. And I suspect you may have been aware through Tim's class that the Declaration of Independence refers to our Indigenous people in this country as merciless Indian savages. So we have come a long way, and we have a long way to go, and we've got consequences from those actions. So the Department of the Interior today has two agencies that are closely tied into tribes: the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education. They used to be one and the same, and then they're separate, but they all roll up through the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs. And, when I took this job, I had a lot of experience in the business sector, very limited experience other than calling on prior secretaries of the Interior, members of Congress, to advocate for, public lands and open space and things like that. And so I was given a lot of words to say when I got there, including, part of our job at Interior is to uphold trust and treaty obligations to American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so I talked with Kevin Washburn, who is our head of Indian Affairs, and he's a member of the Chickasaw Nation. And I said, Kevin, I need some help. I don't want just words to read. I want to know what they mean, and I want to absorb them, and I want to make sure I live up to them. So help me understand what our obligations are, what my obligations are. And it was pretty interesting. He said something that I used consistently through the 4 years in government. And that is, Sally, it's as simple as this: don't forget the Indians. And so what he's saying is, we have treaties and obligations that require us to consult, to educate, to provide healthcare, to provide housing, to provide all kinds of services that we signed up for and are obligated to provide when we took over these lands. And of course, the concept of private property wasn't even considered by Indigenous people. And those decisions had profound consequences. and they had profound consequences well beyond the Department of the Interior. So when he said, don't forget the Indians, he further said, the Department of the Interior is the advocate for tribes among the agencies of government, yet every agency of government has responsibility to tribes. And that is what they expect of you as the Secretary of the Interior. And I'll help you get there. So one of the most powerful early meetings I had, I think in the first day or certainly the first week, was a meeting with tribal leaders where they were praying for me in their native languages and in English, and tears were streaming down my face. But it was, one of those powerful moments where you got a sense of the gravity of the role. And I will say it's one of the most joyful and difficult parts of my time as secretary. A few other things, 10 bureaus, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education I mentioned, the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, both of which are offshore, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Bureau of Reclamation. Let's see, what did I leave off? That's it, I think. And then we were responsible for upholding our obligations to the Pacific Island nations that we bombed the heck out of during World War II, as well as the territories in the Pacific and the Caribbean. So that's the job. It's kind of broad. And you can see why it was called the Department of Everything Else. At any rate, that's, I got up to speed because my job was like studying for a final every night. And I had guides along the way, and I'm sure you can all relate to that, although maybe not in Tim's class. He just might make you run up a mountain or two. I would say that, we made some progress, but we had a lot of work to continue to do. And it's not something that my job as an engineer or as a banker, although I did bank some tribes, or even as REI, really set me up to understand. So it's a steep learning curve and one that I'm still on. So does that cover the landscape?
I think so. And, as you've said, the Bureau of, or the Department of Everything Else, oftentimes you probably find yourself at sort of conflicts of interest with one department wanting to do something, or I should say one agency wanting to do something and one agency needing to do something that might actually be in direct conflict with something else that another agency is trying to do.
Yeah.
So I can imagine there's some challenges there.
Lots of challenges there. I mean, a couple of examples. Each agency has a charge that typically comes through an authorizing legislation, the Organic Act in the name of the Park Service, and FLTMA, the Federal Lands Management Policy Act for the Bureau of Land Management, the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and so on. And so when you have an agency whose job it is, like the BLM, to manage lands for multiple use and sustained yield, that means some cases development for oil, gas, solar, wind, mining. It means grazing. It takes place on ancestral homelands for tribes. And, they care about access to the land, protection of sacred sites, all of that. And oftentimes those things are in conflict, especially when you have a state like Nevada. 87% of Nevada is owned by the federal government in terms of the land. Most of it's BLM. And, the state wants to have control over things like mining, permitting, and grazing and other economic activities. And so sometimes you find the states pitted against the tribes and the tribe pitted against the BLM, or even the Fish and Wildlife Service, where they're restricting areas, but those areas need to be accessible to tribes. Park Service as well. You'd think that there might be a good synergy there, but the Park Service is pretty buttoned up. And so during our administration, John Jarvis, the director of the Park Service, created policies that allowed Indigenous people to gather traditional plants in National Park Service lands, but that had not been allowed for a long time. And even when Tim and I went with the class up to Glacier Bay, and I only went kayaking for part of a day with them before they went off on their 10-day, very wet, very cold trip to Glacier Bay. But we heard from the park superintendent and the leader of the Hoona Indian community, where the Hoona used to use Glacier Bay as, part of its larder. They'd harvest gull eggs, they'd harvest seals. Their legends tie very directly into what happened in the creation of Glacier Bay in terms of rapid acceleration of the glacier, which is why it was set aside as a national park. And those two individuals worked together to reconcile a lot of the damage that had been done. And the park now allows gull egg collecting, but they still need approval from NOAA for marine mammal collecting, like seals, which are not endangered. So it's complicated, and it's not because people don't necessarily want to do the right thing. It's that they're authorizing statutes pit one agency against the other. And boy, I learned that early on, that this is a job that's all about conflict, and it's hard, but you can find common ground, and sometimes you just have to change the laws or the rules, and we did some of that too.
Yeah, that's great. Let's maybe dig in a little bit more into some more examples. I'm glad you brought in the example from Glacier Bay, but more specifically, I want to know, what the Department of the Interior is doing to reconcile its relationship with tribes over its historical treatment of Indigenous people and Indigenous lands, for that matter. What have been some successes and challenges in this area? You've given us a little bit of insight here, but I'd love to hear more about some of the successes and some of the unique arrangements maybe that you helped broker. I'm also thinking about things such as maybe apologizing for past wrongs, or working to restore trust where trust has been lost, or even things like giving land back to tribes, which is something we've talked a little bit in this seminar series. So yeah, giving land back, making tribes co-managers of resources. What have been some successes and challenges in this area?
Well, so many, and I know we want to make sure we get to student questions, so I'll try and be succinct, and I'll look for you jumping about a little if I'm going on too long, because it's a long question. First, it's very hard in a 4-year period of time or an 8-year period of time to right the wrongs that have taken place over hundreds of years. And yet that is essential to healing. And of course, it begins with acknowledgement. And there were many, many meetings that I had where, I felt very much on the firing line for the sins of the US government going back for generations. And you listen. And Kevin was a thoughtful guide to me. He's the dean of the law school at the University of Iowa now. He's a lawyer and he's gone back to academia. But he said, Sally, it's not personal. It's just important that you listen. And I did a lot of listening. And I pushed back on my team to say, please do not schedule me tightly when I'm visiting a tribe. I need maybe double the time or triple the time that you might expect, because I don't want to walk out in the middle of something that's really important, which is oftentimes, it is important, and it feels critical to them and to me to be there and have that time. So there are a lot of things that I'm really proud of that happened during the Obama administration, both before I got there and during the time that I was there. I don't know if you studied the land fractionation in this class at all, but I'll talk about it, and Tim, just jump in if you've already covered this. But with the moving of federal policies and violation of treaties over the years, there was one point, and I can't remember, it's like 1930s or something like that, where Congress said, we're tired of dealing with these reservations. These aren't working. We're just going to give land to individuals, and then they can have that, and then we're done with these reservations. And that's what they did. So, they would give Tim 160 acres to farm, graze, whatever else. And then Tim, not used to any kind of culture of land ownership, doesn't really understand what that means. And also, he passes on, and he's got 6 children. And absent any will, which of course is also not part of the culture, that land gets, there's 6 people that now own that piece of land. And then each of those people have 6 children, and you've got 36 in the next generation. And there are some parcels of land, particularly in the Great Plains, where there's more than 1,000 owners, and nobody knows where they are. And the tribe can't do anything with that land because there is not clear ownership. So you've got some squatters, including, mostly non-native, that will allow their cattle to graze, and the tribe is powerless to do anything about it, even though it's within the reservation boundary, let alone their ancestral homelands. Eloise Cobell was named in a lawsuit as the plaintiff on what's called the Cobell settlement. And she said, this is not living up to your treaty obligations. And under Ken Salazar's leadership as Secretary of the Interior, and a really thoughtful Justice Department under Eric Holder, that case was settled. And I think it's the largest case ever settled by the US government. And it was $3.4 billion. Some of that went to individual tribal members, and a large chunk of it, I think $1 billion, went to buy back land for the tribe so that it could be taken into trust for the reservation. And there was a whole army of people that Interior was overseeing, including contractors, to facilitate buying as much, tracing down individual Indians, getting them to turn, buying their land, their fraction of the land at fair market value with a minimum to make sure they, that it was worth their while to participate. And once we had over 50%, we could take it into trust for the tribe, which means that the tribe owns it. They can't sell it. The subsequent tribal government can't try and make money for the tribal council if, they weren't inclined to keep the land. It is held in trust for the tribe. So that, I think that we had 1 million acres. My numbers are a little fuzzy, but I think we took 1 million acres back into trust for tribes through that program. We also did a land buyback program where the trust said, we are going to buy land that was part of our ancestral homeland from private buyers, and we want you, government, to take it into trust for us so that it will remain, and we can use it collectively as part of the tribe. So that was really, it's one really important step about restoring the ability of tribes to create economic activity and to make use of the land even within their reservation boundaries that they have. And most tribes do not own the land now in their reservations. There's a lot of private land ownership. I also found out that there were, hundreds of lawsuits that tribes had brought against the federal government to hold it accountable for upholding obligations that the federal government, literally through the Justice Department, had been fighting for decades. It's like somebody sues you, you fight, without sort of stepping back saying, "Oh, wait a minute, they're not wrong." So we settled over 100 of these lawsuits. And the biggest one that was not associated with water was one we did with Navajo Nation. And I think that the federal treasury paid out $450 million in damages, basically, for not upholding our end of the bargain. There's another one we did with the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nations. And I want to say that was like $150 million. We're talking big numbers here. And then there's water rights, and a lot of the water has been taken without compensating the tribes for it, even though their water rights are senior, and those are very complicated, longstanding agreements. But we made progress on those, but they do take decades to get done. And I was totally blessed to have a Deputy Secretary of the Interior, Mike Connor, who's a water expert. He's a lawyer, he's a civil engineer. He worked in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He was a lead water rights lawyer for the Department of the Interior, and he ran the Bureau of Reclamation, which is all the water in the West, basically, that's not managed by the Corps of Engineers. And so Mike is actually President Biden's nominee right now to run the Corps of Engineers. So he will have run pretty much every federal dam in the United States. He was my right arm, and he was so helpful in getting these things done. But I also will say that after Mike left office, he was invited to join the Taos Pueblo because his grandfather was a member of the tribe. So he's now actually a member of the Taos Pueblo tribe, which is really cool. But just a super guy. So, I mean, there's so many more things that we worked on in terms of cooperative management on public lands and Bears Ears and all of that. I don't know if you want me just to keep rambling here, Tim, or if you want
yeah. I think it'd be interesting to hear about how Bears Ears was developed. Another idea. I know you've talked about Chickasaw National Park under a unique lease agreement. Those might be some good examples.
I mean, we know around the world that the places with the most intact ecosystems and biodiversity have been under the continual stewardship of Indigenous people. And yet we do not recognize and respect that within our own country. And one of the secretarial orders that I wrote was encouraging land management agencies to work with tribes on cooperative management agreements. They couldn't turn over the management of their lands to tribes by statute, so it would need an act of Congress to change it. But that's something I think Secretary Holland is going to pick up and work on during her time as secretary. But we had some really interesting examples where we pushed the envelope as far as we felt that we could. And there may be more creative solutions that they're working on right now. Bears Ears National Monument. You probably all are familiar with that. It was recommended that the Antiquities Act be used to protect these lands within Bears Ears, which is in the Four Corners area. It's all within Utah, but it's at Four Corners, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, where there are so many cultural sites, particularly visible, the ancient Pueblo cultures, the cliff dwellings and so on. But they actually are sacred to 5 tribes. 2 of them are the Hopi and the Zuni are traditional Pueblo cultures, so more place-based and agrarian. And the other 3, the Ute Mountain Ute, the Ute tribe, and the Navajo, were more migratory with the seasons. And these lands were sacred to all of them. And they did not always get along, including in recent years. And yet they came together to urge us to protect Bears Ears National Monument because the sites were being looted, had been looted for generations. There was, with Instagram and, popular social media sites driving people to visit, they had sort of unfettered visitation and people posting, ancient pots that they'd find or other artifacts on their Instagram page, and they may visit with respect and leave it as it was. But then a criminal would go along, find the geotag on that posting, and that would lead them right to the site so that they could loot. So, just modern technology was leading to greater threats. And there are more traditional threats of, incursion by OHVs and sort of unauthorized roads and firewood gathering by non-tribal members and oil, gas, mineral development, and so on. So the tribes wanted a hand in managing, and we couldn't go as far as they wanted, but we set up a commission for them to consult with the land management agencies. And over time, I hope that the land management agencies will hire tribal members to actually do the work, or we'll get legislation to support that. Of course, you may have tracked that Trump undid that because Utah politicians did not want it. And some of that is because they have advocates for, ongoing historical uses, including looting. They won't tell you that, but it's sport for many people that have lived in that area for generations. And yet Utah, touts itself with the Mighty 5 national parks and so on as an outdoor mecca. So Trump reversed it, we think illegally. Biden recently reinstated it. And the law needs to be clarified that it's a one-way ratchet, that it would make no sense for a president, for Congress to pass a law to protect antiquities that were under threat and critical sites under threat if the next president could just come along and undo it. And so I am more than hopeful that Bears Ears National Monument will be protected effectively for years to come. Grand Canyon was, the naysayers when it was made a national monument to prevent mining, largely was, cited to be ruinous to the economy of Arizona. And of course, that didn't turn out to be the case either. So at any rate, that's kind of what happened within Bears Ears. And the collaborating with the tribes was unique in that particular case, but I don't think it'll be unique in the future. I think there's a lot of lessons learned from that. So there are other examples. Tim mentioned the Chickasaw National Recreation Area, which is adjacent to the Chickasaw Reservation. The tribe wanted a hand in managing it and interpreting it. The Chickasaw Nation was displaced from the southeast in the Trail of Tears. And they have a very rich cultural history from the move to Oklahoma and there, plus many of the traditions that they carry on. Got a beautiful museum and cultural center. And they have worked with the Park Service to put a bridge linking the two. The Park Service leases land from the tribe for the visitor center. And the superintendent of the national park is a member of the Chickasaw Nation. So those are some steps that they can take that go part way. And it's a tribe that does well financially for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is, they had oil revenue in their history. But some other examples, there's reconciliation that the tribe did with the national park in Glacier Bay that I referenced. The Otna region of Alaska, which is nestled between Fairbanks and Anchorage, was concerned because a lot of its subsistence hunters were being, the hunt was being conducted by people that lived in Fairbanks and Anchorage. So they could do that by state law as Alaskans, and there was really no effective management of that resource on federal lands. And so they asked to play a role, which we allowed them to have. Now we needed cooperation from the state. And that, I think, the pendulum swings back and forth with the politics there. But, that was a step in that direction. And one other example was the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe said, we'd like to be responsible for taking over the National Bison Range. So it is a place where our nation, through the Fish and Wildlife Service, raises bison and protects bison, and it's completely surrounded by CSKT, Confederated Salish Kootenai. And we said, yeah, it makes sense for you to manage it. It's within your reservation. But that took an act of Congress, and I believe that happened in the last administration. So those are a few examples. It's like nothing's easy, but we're making progress. And I think the federal land managers are much more open to it than they would have been in years past. And so it's more gradual than I'd like, but it's happening.
Excellent. So I do see a question from a student here. I'm going to ask one more question, though, that actually came from a student initially, and then I'll get Zoe's question. And that is, what are the chances of, or the possibilities for restoring the Indigenous name Mount Tahoma to Mount Rainier in this region? And do you have any insight on that based on the process that it took to restore the name Denali to Mount McKinley?
Yeah, it came across like it was as simple as a stroke of a pen, which is not true. The state of Alaska passed legislation requesting that the Board of Geographic Names, which is part of the U.S. Geological Survey, which is in Interior, change the name of Mount McKinley to Denali, not Mount Denali, just Denali, which is the traditional name from the Athapascan people. So they presented that, and a Congress member or several from the state of Ohio objected because McKinley was from Ohio. In fact, there's a hilariously funny and sad video on this on YouTube. So I think if you Google, Denali, McKinley, Ohio, Alaska, or something, you'll probably pop up. Anyway, it's a juxtaposition of the head of the McKinley Museum with an Alaska native. And McKinley'd never been to Alaska, certainly never climbed Mount McKinley, had no connections to it. And the people of Ohio really don't care, but they wanted McKinley because he's from Ohio. In fact, she even acknowledged he wasn't even a great president. So it's very funny because they're juxtaposing back and forth. The fact is that I had the authority, and my chief of staff, who's now Deputy Secretary of the Interior, Tommy Bodrow, who's from Alaska, found this in the statutes and said, hey, Sally, I think you've got the authority to change McKinley to Denali because, and we wanted to do something for Alaska around a climate change conference that was taking place up there. And so the rule says after, if there is no objection to a name change, or after a process that has remained unresolved for a reasonable period of time, the Secretary of the Interior can make a decision to change a place name. And that's what happened with Denali. So Alaska every year wanted to do it, and they introduced legislation, and every year Ohio introduced legislation to not do it, and so they locked it up, but nobody really was taking any action. And that's why I did it, and that's why it stuck. Tahoma is, I believe, a Nisqually name. There are different languages. The mountain is important to the Yakama Nation, and it has a different name for it. And I don't know how many names were or are in use by tribes in the region for this very prominent feature. But the first thing I think that would need to be done is that tribal communities come together and agree on a name, and then they propose a name change to the Washington state legislature. And then, that then could be proposed to the federal government. And if there aren't any objections, I think it would move forward much quicker. But the secretary doesn't have a magic pen that is able to change it. But it does require some work. And I will say that one thing I learned is that everything has a constituency. So I guarantee you Rainier has a constituency. It is businesses named for Rainier. It is tradition, it is towns and, named for Rainier. It was a bank that I used to work for. It just goes on and on. And so it's not as simple as it appears, but I'd be supportive.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you think that the National Park Service could play a role in this? And for example, I know that I believe Denali National Park was called McKinley National Park,
it was.
Right? And that preceded the name change, right?
Yeah, it was. And I used to know what the legal process was for that, and I'm not sure what it was now, Tim, whether it's something that, I feel like the Park Service, I don't know, maybe they could unilaterally change it. That's possible.
Or at least if they change the name of the park, that could set the precedent for changing the name of the peak. But I think you make a good point about the tribes needing to coalesce around a single name.
Yeah, and if I was advising the Park Service, I'd say that's absolutely the first step before the park makes assumptions about what tribes would want it to be called. It's about listening and understanding kind of what you're getting into. Because I think the Park Service changed the name. I'm not sure if it was consistent with 1975 legislation to change the name of the mountain. I feel like it was after that when they did it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I see that Zoe has her hand up. Zoe, go ahead and ask a question.
Thank you again for taking time out of your day to meet with us. And my first question was in response to your remark about how within the department you made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot more to do. Can you give examples of different actions you would want the department to take in the future that would help with like reconciliation and co-management of lands and other things around that nature?
Yeah. One thing I'd like to see the agencies do is build deeper and more trusting relationships with tribes. I think it is hard to get congressional action done, but it is not hard to reach out to neighboring tribes and those whose ancestral homelands you're on to build a relationship and to talk. It was the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina that really moved the Park Service to allow for the collection of plants that are traditional to their culture from the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. The park had problems with illicit plant gathering, plants like ginseng, for example, by non-natives. And so, they were worried about kind of opening it up to tribes and not being able to enforce effectively who was using it. And the tribe worked closely with them on that. And I would say that, one of the things I'd love to see is land management agencies themselves understanding and acknowledging the stewardship of tribes of these lands before they were under their stewardship, and working to learn from them. One of the things that we did with the U.S. Geological Survey under the Obama administration was create climate science centers around the country. There's one hosted right now at the University of Washington. It rotates between several universities in the area. I think before it was at Oregon State, but it's looking at changes to the climate that are happening locally. And during my time there, we worked with the USGS to budget for a tribal liaison who could bring traditional ecological knowledge to those climate science centers actions. And I don't think they're represented in every one of the climate science centers, but I was just listening to a talk or participating in an event yesterday at the Foster School where it was referenced in terms of the value being added here with that traditional knowledge. And scientists like to think they have all the answers, but the reality is, if you talk in their language about the value of tribes and you say things like, how would you like to have thousands of years of observed data on what's happened in these landscapes? People begin to recognize that, just as I mentioned on the trip that I did with Tim and his class to Glacier Bay, part of their legend and creation story and the situation that wiped out their village was this glacial action that accelerated the movement of that glacier. And Bob Starbird, the head of the tribe, told this story to us. And it's not like storytelling is folklore. It is history, and it is learnings and teachings. And I was up in Kivalina, Alaska with looking at the impact of that village, which is literally washing into the sea because of climate change. And I sat down for a round table gathering in the high school gym with people who hunted and gathered, which is most tribal members, but these were very experienced tribal members. And I had hunters say, I don't use a snow machine when I hunt, or a 4x4, I hunt on foot. And so I see changes in the landscape. And he talked about the melting permafrost. He talked about the sinkholes that were pulling down the berry bushes and drowning them. He talked about the changing migration patterns of the caribou or reindeer that he had never seen before. He talked about the challenge they had breaking through the frozen surface, because for the first time in his life, and he's about my age, they were getting rain. They'd never seen rain before. They'd never seen storms. They had sort of, like our atmospheric river kind of storms hitting that part of the coast. So that's something else I would do, Zoe, is help educate Western scientists about the value of traditional knowledge. And if you're looking for a book on that topic, I recommend Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a botanist and a professor in New York, but she wrote this book about indigenous scientific knowledge, indigenous wisdom, and the teachings of plants. And that is, one of the actions we could take. I think, again, just listening, as I learned to do much more than was my nature. And pushing all federal agencies to consult with tribes in an authentic basis and holding them accountable when they don't. So it goes beyond a check the box exercise into, an authentic meeting of the minds, and changing the results because of that is also something that needs to happen. We did write a secretarial order on that. It was rescinded by the subsequent administration. I suspect they may have put it back in, but the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, we actually were able to work with the tribe and the Army Corps of Engineers to require that an environmental impact statement be done. It was not done effectively, and because of that, the tribe won in court. The Dakota Access Pipeline was required to do it. They did a slipshod job. Again, it was the pipeline was not approved by the courts, and that's an example of, if they just consulted with the tribe earlier, instead of doing what they did, which is instead of going the straight line north of Bismarck, where people in Bismarck, North Dakota, did not want the risk of their water supply getting polluted, they ran the line south, just north of the reservation, but through some sacred sites, feeling, well, we don't really have to worry about this anymore because it's just a tribe. So that's another really, really important step to take, in addition to the ones I mentioned around cooperative management.
Thank you. Let's get a question from Jeff. Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I see there are a couple in the chat too that I didn't see before, so I didn't want to jump ahead in case one of those came in before mine.
I think actually Sally addressed some of the questions in chat through that answer. So yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Sally, thanks for joining us today. You kind of started to get this question going, so it might be within some of what you just shared, or if there was anything you wanted to add. I wanted to put a question out there in thinking about the federal government being a very influential force within this country, and another one being businesses and corporations. And so recognizing how you've moved from a position in government to now being with the Foster School of Business, I was wondering if there are any ways that you've taken your listening and learning through working with tribes, and now how you're thinking about ways that businesses can begin to implement some of this. Maybe it's valuing traditional ecological knowledge in a way that's not extractive of that knowledge or appropriative, but using what you've learned within business in ways that are sustaining and work towards those stronger relationships that you mentioned.
I got muted. Yes. I think that there is a role for business, and it is important, and they have not generally been at the table. REI, which I'm very familiar with since I worked there for 13 years and led it for some time, has really engaged deeply with tribes. They have funded an effort at the Center for Native American Youth, which I'm involved with, but not because I'm involved there, on something called the, I think it's Ambassadors for Land Conservation, or Native Ambassadors for Land Conservation, hiring Native youth. In this case, I think they piloted it in the Grand Canyon area in the Navajo, to more deeply engage with the Park Service and the community and visitors to the area and so on, to learn how to visit with respect, and also to bring tribal perspectives to the table. So, that's one little example. I think that most businesses are completely clueless when it comes to tribes. And I would say I have an example of one particular company working with, using the legal corruption of our campaign finance system to try and prevent the Department of the Interior from recognizing a tribe which was the Pamunkey tribe of Indians across the Potomac River from the National Harbor, because they did not want, MGM Grand did not want any competition from tribal gaming for the $1 billion casino and complex they were putting in across the river. So we have a long way to go, I think. And I think that the more we listen in places like, the climate science centers to Indigenous knowledge, the more we have tribal leaders like Billy Frank Jr. here who really bridged a divide. And I'm assuming you guys probably know this, but there's, 2 statues for every state sitting in Statuary Hall in DC. One of our statues is Marcus Whitman, and that's going to be replaced, thanks to legislation, by Billy Frank Jr. And Billy Frank Jr. is was the poster child for getting arrested 50 times for standing up for fishing rights. He sued and won a decision called the Bolt decision, which was when I was a student at the University of Washington in 1975, saying that half of the catch of seafood and the fishery in the Puget Sound area would belong to local tribes to uphold the treaty obligations. Billy, I'm just telling you Billy's story because over time, he went from being an activist to recognizing that Puget Sound and the Sailor Sea is in trouble. And 50% of nothing is nothing. So he became an advocate and an ally of seafood industry more broadly, and the environmental community and the state in pushing to do cleanup of Puget Sound and recognize the challenge of our salmon, but many other species as well. So, I believe that opportunities like the one we had at the Foster School, where we introduced the topic through the Climate Science Center of Indigenous knowledge, is a way to start. But I'm not very optimistic that business is going to lead in this effort unless there is, clear motivation and encouragement for them to do so. I think right now, like Eric Artz, who's the CEO of REI right now, and some of his staff, I think it's more done by more enlightened folks who are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and choose to do that themselves rather than it being forced in some way, because I think that would be really difficult, just practically speaking.
Great. Let's see. I wonder if we have any more questions here. I don't see any in chat, but yeah, this is your opportunity. Sally, maybe I'll follow up on that just briefly here. So we had a speaker earlier this quarter who was talking about capitalism more broadly, and she perceived capitalism as being at odds with the sort of environmental philosophies that maybe have been and are still held by Indigenous peoples, and so she was advocating. It's difficult for me to maybe articulate this, and you obviously weren't at that seminar, but in a way, indigenizing our economics more broadly, not just incorporating Indigenous knowledge or reaching out to tribes, but somehow more philosophically changing our economic system. And I don't know if you have any feelings on that or perspective on that. I know you led an interesting conversation for Earth Lab earlier this quarter with an Indigenous businesswoman, I guess you could say, for lack of better term there. And she, I think, had some interesting ideas about what Indigenous knowledge is and how it's sort of this deep philosophy permeates maybe her view of doing business and participating in this capitalistic system. Does that make sense? Or
well, I think I'll take a crack at it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a magic answer. I think it's unlikely especially in this country at this point in time, that we're going to have radical change to the capitalistic system. That is not who the United States is. And, we have enough problems addressing climate change and trying to figure out how to do that when people in general are resistant to changing their behavior. So here's how I would go about it. And I'll use the Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock as an example. It's cost the pipeline company, far more money by trying to fight the rules and fight tribal consultation and listening than it would if they'd done it right to begin with. And so one of the keys that can be done, and I'd say this is true for the environment as well, is we've got to align economic interests with environmental interests or indigenous interests in this case, and the two are not unrelated. And so I mentioned REI and its support philanthropically for a program for conservation ambassadors from tribes. That's not going to move the meter materially. It's going to set a good example. It might make a difference in a few places or in the lives of a few people, but to really move the meter, you change the rules so that collaborating and working with tribes is the most economic path forward. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to use the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, which Tim mentioned in that rather lengthy introduction. So we'll call it DRECP. What is that? It's recognizing that California has renewable energy standards and they want to move. The Mojave Desert is very sunny and actually quite windy, and there's enormous potential there. But it is also a place that is the homeland of a number of different bands and tribes that has sacred sites. It is a place that is home to a very unique ecosystem that supports the endangered desert tortoise. It is a place where wealthy people oftentimes retire and live, and maybe not so wealthy people, and they kind of like looking at wind farms and solar arrays. So there's all kinds of conflicts. The Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, which was begun by the head of the California BLM under, I think, like the last year of the Bush administration. And it took the entire Obama administration to get through to finalizing the deal. And we only got the federal part finalized, the state's still in process, that said, let's zone. People don't like the word zoning, but let's set aside the areas that are most disturbed, that have the greatest potential, that are close to transmission, that already have roads to them, that aren't desert tortoise habitat and aren't, and we pre-cleared with the neighbors and we pre-cleared with the tribes by thoughtful consultation where they wanted us to go and where they didn't want us to go. And, where a site might conflict with a sacred site, which, they're not willing to say, hey, these are our sacred sites, because they're sacred and they're part of their culture, their traditions that are not to be shared. So we pre-cleared all that stuff. And then we provide an incentive to business. So California has its renewable energy standards. So there's plenty of companies wanting to buy renewable energy. So you got a ready market. You've got the science behind, is this a good place to put solar and wind? You've pre-cleared it, and you go to the companies, the merchant power generators, and you say, if you go to one of these zones, you will have your permit within 90 days. We've already done the environmental impact statement. We've already consulted with the tribes. We've already worked with the neighbors. We've already selected places that are going to cost you less money to develop, and we'll get you your permit fast. That's the kind of role that government can play with thoughtful regulations and policies and incentives that aligns the interests of tribes and the interests of the environment and conservation with business interests.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess I should also add that in some cases, tribes actually are interested in these business opportunities as well. And I think maybe sometimes that piece is left out.
The Moapa band of Paiute Indians in Nevada actually did a big solar installation. I think we're past the hour mark, Tim.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, so we are going to end here. So thank you so much, Sally. This has been fascinating and enlightening as always. And we're just incredibly grateful that you were able to join us tonight to continue this really wonderful series of conversations that we've been having this quarter. So I think there's a lot to reflect on, and I'll be curious to read the student reflections. So thank you so much, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon, Sally.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody, for